Hello.
Hello,
So,
hello E. Good morning.
hi.
Yeah, we're
Uh,
just waiting for a few minutes for Bin Bin and Akash to join.
okay. One question. Are you rotating the host with Akash?
Actually, we're trying to rotate between all the maintainers. So I've left a note in the
Okay.
notes. Moderator today would be Bin Bin. So I'm going to make you the host now, Bin Bin, while you set up your screen.
Okay. So last week it was Akash, right?
Yes. And next week it'll be me again.
Okay.
Okay, I'm good. Let me share my screen.
Thank you, Bin Bin. I know Akash have other priorities today, so I'm not sure if he'll be able to join, but we'll give maybe a couple of more minutes. We can probably start at 10:05, 8:05.
Yeah.
And I've
So
left
can
a
you see my
note.
screen?
Yes, I can see your screen, Bin Bin.
Cool.
Bin Bin, do you know that the agenda items, should we update the PR review meeting for PM attendance? Was that added by E or you?
Oh, I did that.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I'm wondering if since we already have the PR review meeting and we go through like a lot of status there, should we just skip that for the community call and then we'll have more time to focus on the issue discussion?
Sure, that also makes sense to me. And yeah, and also for the PR details, I think PM will maybe it's not their priority.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's try that today.
Okay,
Just, yeah, we can check if people have any specific PR discussions. If yes, we can just extract them in the agenda.
sure.
But I don't have anything from my side. I don't know, Bin Bin, Akash, do you have any specific discussions for specific PRs?
Yeah, I don't have much. I'm also recently I'm also working on something else.
Yeah,
Yeah,
cool.
nothing from my side.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks.
guys.
Then I guess we can just go ahead with our discussion agenda.
Okay, cool. We just have 5 people. Okay, now let's start. First, we will go through the discussion agenda items, and we just discussed that. So in the future, we will just discuss the like PRs in the PR review meeting, and because I think currently PM will not join the PR meeting review, so we will not do the issue triage during the PR meeting, but we can do that in the community meeting. And also we may need to have an announcement in the Slack channel so that everybody will know that. And the second item, discuss the third and key fetch design from Josh. Let me check it. Okay. Yeah, Josh, do you want to share your screen or I can just scroll down?
Yeah, you can drive. That's totally fine.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so the problem statement and kind of this first blob is really a repeat of what E's done in his proposal. And so if we scroll a little bit more, we can get into some of the details, and happy to have open discussion on all these suggested designs. So if you scroll down just a little bit under the proposed solutions, we can probably start there. So it might be good to, if you scroll down towards the bottom, I kind of separated them out, and we can kind of talk to them that way, separating that on issues. Keep going. Probably dev work items in the TOC. There we go.
Okay.
Yeah. So these are kind of the four. Is that 4 bullets? Yeah, 4 brackets or buckets of work that I kind of was able to scope out from the main issue and then from the proposal from E, which would be the very first thing would be the reconciliation loop, like how we would want to go about that. And so that's what the first kind of bullet and the implementation details lays out. And what I'm proposing there is to put a retry on the reconciler would be on the control mechanism for just the entire KMP resource. And then that would allow all the other providers to be reset there. And again, we can talk more in details. I'm just trying to get a high level overview. And then from that update loop, it would basically be on a timer. So whatever, say it's a 2-minute interval, we can get into details of that in just a minute. Then it would refresh all the other providers down below that are attached to the KMP. And then from there we would be revising and looking at the logic for the verifiers to handle multiple versions of certificates. So I don't know if that's possible yet today. If we'll go through a retry, like say there's 3 or 4 valid versions of a particular key or certificate. I don't quite yet understand the logic inside the verifier. So there's probably some work to do on the verifier side to rotate through all the keys that are in memory in the map for a particular provider. And then the fourth one would be some method of manually triggering the reconcile besides just recreating the resource itself. So those are kind of the 4 bigger buckets of work that we can go into more detail. So that's kind of a big overview. So if we want to go back up to the implementation details heading, we can kind of dive into more specifics. So here in the periodic retrieval of keys and certificates, what I'm proposing is that we add some kind of parameter in here for an update interval. And then that can be defined by the user, and we'll also have a default value. So if they don't specify one, there will be a default kind of set inside of the reconcile method that we could basically, if you see that snippet right above there, it'll just retrigger. The controller will handle that. So it's going to be at the KMP level, and then all the providers independently will be triggered. So the way that this stands now is all providers are going to go off the same interval and be refreshed that way. So one decision we need to make here would be, is that okay? Should we have all providers be at one interval and one global value? Or do we want to have more control and say Key Vault is going to refresh at a 1-minute interval, but cosine or this inline is going to refresh at a 5-minute interval? And so we'd have to think through, how can we have the controller itself, the reconcile method trigger, but then honor the more downstream providers interval. So that's one implementation detail that we can go into. But this is the general proposition, is to have the main reconcile logic live inside the reconcile method of the KMP instead of something deeper. So I guess I'll pause there and kind of get everybody's thoughts.
Let's go down.
And if I need more context or anything like that, I can provide, but I'm sure Kosh has some good context too, because he's been helping guide me through the proposal. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, I left
So
a comment around this, Josh. Like I think the two consideration is like what is the customer need? If they need, if it makes sense to just have a global one, or do they need a provider specific one, like Key Vault have different reconciliation pattern to say the inline provider, which inline provider probably doesn't need to be reconciled.
Right.
And the other possibility was at the each resource level, and would it become very complex to debug and configure, and do they actually need it? So I think we want to look at the customer need and also consider the technical feasibility, of course. Like if at any point you feel it's only like only B is feasible and C is not feasible. So we will stop there, but I'll invite E to advise, maybe E and Feynman, like what level of granularity do we need the interval configured? And probably also competitor product. Does kernel refresh the validation certificate? If yes, what is the configuration look like?
Yeah, I think currently, as Susan, you just said, the inline provider, we do not need any refreshing on this. It is purely user specified keys or certificates. So there's no, and it is the specific version if user specify it. So there is no need to do the refresh. And also it is not, for me, I don't think it is even not possible for inline provider to do that because there is no key management system information, provider information, right? So how do you know you want to fetch some version from somewhere? So I think for inline provider, there's no such requirement. And for the Kibono, I think currently based on my investigation, I don't think they support this. I think they support the inline certificate that user needed to specify, but I didn't find any um, automated retrieval versions from Kibono side.
Got it. And just to add, the CSI driver, they configure the secrets at a global level with a default of 2 minutes.
Yeah, speaking of CSI driver, there is interval, but I'm not familiar with the CSI driver. I'm just talking about Kimono from verify image category. So, and also in Kimono, when they integrate with notary project signature, they asking you to specify the root C certificate, not some certificate from any cloud provider. So their current way is to ask user to put the root C certificate and also the trust identity from notary project signature. So in that way, there is also no retrieval because the root certificate will have a very long validity, and the user need to be aware of the validity of the root C certificate and update it manually.
So E,
So
do
I
you
think,
think it's
yeah.
a good balance to just have a default value at the provider level?
Currently, I think you mean the provider level, including inline provider, right?
Yes.
More the
So yeah,
yeah, the
go ahead.
provider under KMP, right? So like that could be, and it could be any of them, but it would skip.
I would suggest that we start with the Azure keyword this type. And in my proposal for these scenarios, there are some investigation for other KMS. For example, for the Google KMS, they didn't support the automated rotation for the asymmetry keys. So so even we want to do that, for example, in the future, we have some Google KMS type of KMP. Even we want to do the automatic retrieval, but we cannot because Google from KMS side, the key will not be rotated automatically for the asymmetric key. So that means if user rotate key, they should inform the verifier to take some actions and update the KMP.
I guess with this particular, the way that it would work on the reconcile method is it would be, since we know the type, we could say, like if you're inline, there's nothing left for you to do. But what this allows us to do is to have the interval set at the higher level. So then say we wanted to start with key vault, instead of implementing it just at the key vault provider level, and having an interval there and then having to repeat that logic if we were to move to, like, we wanted to support Google or we want to support AWS. That way, at least the trigger of the interval would be allowed on those other ones at a higher level. But yeah, we can definitely, it would not impact inline. It would only say, okay, well, you're you're an AKS type resource, so we're now hitting this refresh interval. Let's run the logic to check to make sure that the certs and keys are active, and then all the other cascading stuff that would happen to refresh, just to check the state. So like, did your key get disabled? Do we need is there a new version? The interval would check that. But implementing it this way would still allow us to have a mechanism for all of them if we wanted to, but it would not change anything for inline. It would essentially just skip over them because there isn't anything to do for inline, if that makes sense.
Another question is, I think related to this. So if in the future someone want to implement a type for example, the GCP KMS, so we either have a document that there is a KMP level interval, so you need to be aware of that, or there's some way that the developer can be aware of this kind of interval so that they can overwrite based on their behavior.
Okay.
Yeah, this is just a question maybe related to the implementation detail and considering the new plugin development.
Is the question, where is the interval going to be specified? Is that?
I mean, because currently some of the KMS itself does not support this automated rotation, right? So it doesn't make sense.
Oh, so yeah, it's a little bit higher level than that. It's essentially what this retry would do was whatever the logic is. So that logic that you're talking about, the key rotation, all that logic would be down a little bit further in the provider itself. So if like Google's provider does not have automatic key rotation, then that logic wouldn't be in that provider. This is one higher level at the KMP globally, where you can have the different key providers underneath. So you could have, Key Vault in an inline, and you could have AWS, or you could have Google underneath, but it's all managed by the KMP resource, or CRD, I think is the right terminology. So this is essentially just saying, at this whatever interval, we're just going to rerun your reconcile logic, and then that's passed down to the actual provider itself. So so it's not necessarily directly tied to the automatic rotation. All that logic is going to live in the provider itself. So it's what would happen is, say it hit the 2-minute mark, the reconcile method is going to run. It recognizes that you have an Azure Key Vault resource, and it's going to run that Key Vault resources logic. So if that logic has the detection of auto key rotation, it would go and update the certificates and the keys on Ratify and the resource. But if it say was inline, it would skip. So what this proposal here, the very top one, scenario 1 would be just at what interval are we going to retry our reconcile logic? And then what that reconcile logic means as far as key rotation, revocation, all that stuff, that would be one level down in the provider. So this is just saying at what interval do we want to retry to refresh our certificates and rerun our providers logic? Does that help? It's not directly tied to
Yeah.
automatic rotation.
Okay. So for the scenario 1, maybe Bingbing can scroll up a bit. So from user point of view, how to configure this interval? Will this be covered by another scenario?
It would be each scenario would probably have this particular retry logic. So scenario, this retry logic would happen regardless of how you configured the certificate. So that's just
no, sorry. I mean the interval. I
Mhm.
remember you mentioned a default interval, right?
Yes,
So
that's
it's
the top one. It's even above scenario 1. Yeah.
okay. So it's okay
Mhm.
under the parameters. Okay.
Yeah. So this is a good question. So it could be, this has got it listed underneath the Azure Key Vault parameter type. So it could be there, and that means it's more provider centric, or we can move it up to be at the same level as parameter. So it could be interval, and then that would be more global, right? So like all providers are going to try to refresh their reconcile logic at 2 minutes or 2 hours or whatever. The global versus more local to the provider.
Yeah. So currently it's under parameter, which means
More
this
yeah.
is specific for the Azure keywords, right?
Yep. And that, in my opinion, that makes a little more sense because, like you said, the inline aren't going to benefit from an interval. So then that makes it a little bit more clear that, Azure Key Vault, it would benefit from it. It is going to be triggered.
Yeah.
But
yeah, because if you put under the type, then how about the inline, right? There will be a
yeah, I mean, it would trigger, right? It would be there, but it wouldn't do anything. It would say, "Oh, well, it's static, so I'm just going to move on." So it's a little bit more explicit to the user, I think, this way, in my opinion.
yeah.
I just have one quick question. So if
Sure.
the user just specify like an AKV provider, then would this update interval will be a required parameter or it's an option?
Required or optional? I think it could be optional, and then it would just have a default value, and then you could override it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think normally user should not care about this. We just need to have a good default value for user.
Yeah, this
But if
brings up
user
a
has
good reminder.
Yeah.
Go ahead, E. I'll let you finish.
Yeah, I almost finished. I think it will be optional. If even we want to make it a required, user do not know how to configure it. This requires some knowledge to understand the frequency.
Yeah, from a technical perspective, Josh, we don't currently have a default webhook. So when a customer when they apply this CR, and let's say this is not provided, what's the experience when they describe the resource, given that this is optional, but we still have a default value? But if we want it to be as a part of the spec with the default value, we might need to implement the default webhook. So whenever a resource gets created, we need to set some default values. Then it's shown on the CR.
Okay.
Just a note there. Binbin, do we have a default webhook? I don't think we've set up our conversion and default webhooks.
Yeah, it's not set up yet.
Yeah, so just a note about this, Josh.
Okay, no, that's great. I appreciate it.
So Josh, I have some questions, but this is more implementation specific.
Sure.
So for the reconcile retrigger functionality, that operates at the individual resource level, right? So is there some sort of registration that happens, I'm assuming with the manager, the CRD manager, to basically call this specific reconcile for that specific resource at some specified interval, right? So this is not for every single KMP is going to get triggered at whatever interval that you've set. It's a specific KMP resource.
Yeah, it's the KMP resource. Yep. It's
Okay.
those instances will be essentially what will happen is as soon as it's done with its once it's created, like you've applied it, you've done the Helm chart or whatever, and it creates the KMP resource. The reconcile just actually puts another job in to say whatever when I return my state, I'm going to return back this job to say run me again in 2 minutes or an hour or whatever it is, and so then it'll run that entire resource that method again on the resource. So that way the interval retry logic is all handled by Kubernetes and not necessarily anything that we're doing underneath.
Got it. So that's specific to that. So the job is specific to this specific resource that you're running. So it's
Yep.
not a job that's going to try to reconcile every single key management provider resource type, right?
I believe so.
Okay.
So.
Okay. So then the second question I have, and this is more of a discussion, I don't have an opinion either way yet, but this approach is very Kubernetes centric. Do we need to consider the fact that in the future, if we do decide to run Ratify as a standalone server, this retry mechanism, fetching and retrieval, would not carry over there?
What would be the other scenarios that Ratify would run outside of Kubernetes that would be long running, where it would need a retry?
So off the top of my head, I could see it running as a service on a node. So in collaboration at runtime with a containerd plugin, you could potentially be running Ratify as a service there. And then there could be other scenarios, but I don't know if they're important enough or we need to think about those, but I just thought we should at least discuss that. But that's also why the way that we've written the Ratify server, it is kind of like a standalone HTTP server that you can start up via even the CLI. So we don't have a current use case for non-Kubernetes usage of a long-lasting Ratify server, but in the future we could. So I don't know if it's important enough for us to design a solution around that, or we will just kind of accept that this is the limitation and then we will kind of cross that bridge in the future.
Well, if everybody likes the Kubernetes way, it's like a 1 or 2 line change. So like we get a retry pretty cheap. But I don't know enough about the built-in web server to know what would go in there, but we could definitely bring that as a discussion item. I think it's the easiest path to get a retry mechanism in our current implementation for the broader use case. But yeah, I guess I don't have a context on web server, but that would also work and help other scenarios. Depends on just how much time I want it to take, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. This is definitely will suit the current need the best. I'm curious if anyone else has any thoughts on this. Susan, Binbin.
I have one. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, E.
Yeah, I have one comment. So for the reconcile, currently the Ratify reconcile mechanism, based on my testing, it seems it is only triggered when, for example, if you have some configuration issue. For example, if you have a wrong configuration for the KMP, the reconcile will be triggered to periodically check whether this resource whether you apply a new resource so it can get updated in time. But as I reported the issue, so if the status is not, I mean, the key, for example, the key status is updated in KMS. However, from Ratify side, the resource itself, it is correct. So there's no reconcile, right? So Ratify does not know the latest status. So maybe I didn't remember clearly whether Akash fixed this or not. Maybe it fixed, but will this fix also apply to the scenario that Akash you mentioned, the container D scenarios or other scenarios?
So yes, so this is if let's say your identity lost access or you revoked access to that identity, and then on our side, we don't actually check to see if the permissions have changed. So do an outbound key vault call. Is that the scenario you're talking about, Yi?
Yeah, I mean the current reconcile mechanism apply to the other scenario as you just mentioned, for example, the container D case.
So in the container D case, you wouldn't actually be running Ratify in CRD mode. You would have to kind of fall back on our old config manager way of doing things, which is where we'd be watching updates to our config file and then changing resources accordingly. So the problem still remains in the container D side of things if we take the CRD approach for reconciling the certificates. So reconciling the KMPs for that, because you would need a Ratify in-house implementation that can actually pull, set up some sort of task to pull and then go out and reach out to AKV rather than having the CRD be the mechanism that triggers the refetch. So we would need to actually implement that whole timing and task creation mechanism.
Okay, so that means that so currently for our existing reconcile work, this also doesn't apply to the container D scenario, right? We need to, because this is based on the CRD, it's Kubernetes stuff, right? So for the
Yep.
container D case, we needed to build something by ourselves.
Yeah, I think before we drift into that conversation, because we don't even know what container D would even look like if we would even build a service, right? I think the general idea I'm trying to get to is that should we consider this as an option? Like, do we need to consider making a more ratified in-house polling mechanism versus relying on the CRD to give us that functionality? So that in the future, if we do decide to either use it in container D or some other use case comes up, we will be able to benefit from that rather than kind of having to reinvent the wheel there.
Okay.
Yeah. And I definitely agree that I think the CRD case right now makes the most sense in terms of our use case. It's just, let's say 6 months from now, we're pursuing, a service, a standalone Ratify service at the container D level or some other integration. And we're looking at, okay, where are all the pieces that are missing for that? And this might be one of those bigger pieces missing. So
Not to go too much further into the into the drift, but I'm curious, is that web server currently deployed in the cluster? So it would be like, say you could add an endpoint to the web server that's in a pod, and you would just, it would be like the, fetch certificates endpoint. Is that kind of what you're, like, how that would be implemented at a high level?
we could do it that way. And that would be one way of doing it, but I think it would actually be that you would have the core Ratify server process handling the spawning of these tasks that can call, the get certificates, get keys method. So the equivalent of creating, Kubernetes, like you said, the jobs that are created via the reconcile method to call the reconcile method after a certain period of time, we would have our own sort of scheduling system in Ratify, which
Okay.
adds a lot more complexity. And I think as Sajid mentioned that maybe we stay away from that right now. But I'm just bringing it up as a point of conversation so that we at least check that more, that we discussed it before we go down this route.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Sanjay?
I just had a quick question. We do have an interface that we could depend on, right? Like in the sense of if we were to implement it against a host file system, right, like what we did before, that's probably what would happen if we try to just prototype it on top of Containerd. And the same key update notification API is, I think, what's important, whether it comes from a CRD or whether it comes from a host file system. As long as that abstraction is there, maybe it's okay. So do we have a notion of that right now?
So we deal with all of our certs and keys in memory. So we don't have a concept of, reading from a directory structure for that.
I mean, less of the directory structure question. I think what I was trying to say is, like, do we have a notion of the key set changed, and can we gracefully fall into a new key set? And that way, if the change notification is coming from the host versus the change notification coming from the CRD, it really doesn't matter. Basically, you're trying to propagate a set of notification APIs rather than and literally delegating the fact that rotation can happen at any point in time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So decouple the actual notification from the rotation of the keys and certificates, right?
Right, because I mean, when we did like auto rotation, the whole idea was that the underlying certs change, right? And upstream components are expected to pick it up ASAP. And so as long as we in Ratify, there is an API or there is a contract that says we can detect key changes, and this is how any publisher can publish key changes. And whether we store it in memory in the core Ratify or whether we do it any other way, as long as the change notification is standardized, we could have the CRD publish it, or have a file system publish it, or Containerd publish it. Because I mean, in Azure, we bind it to the host, right? The certs kind of come on the host sometimes. So, and it's in some directory or some location, or maybe even in memory. So it leaves us some room to expand into different scenarios later. Anyway, that's just my 2 cents.
I think that's a good point. So we have decoupled the whole get keys, get certificates implementation, which is the actual fetching logic and updating the underlying in-memory representation of those. But we don't have a mechanism for like a change event, like you're saying.
Right.
So yeah.
I think
So
that's
we
what
fetch-
we standardize on. Sorry, go ahead.
We fetch the certificates on verification. So each of the verifier, they have a method for get certificates or get keys. So they.
But we fetch the cert from the from memory.
Yeah. So
Yep. If the notification mechanism, when some change is notified and the certificate, wherever we keep it, whether it's on disk, on some directory on the host, as long as we're getting the latest when we do the validation, that's decoupled.
Yeah. So
Yes.
So like Binbin said, we keep the verifiers reach out to the central memory store. So as long as you keep that up to date, then it'll work. And then currently we just use the CRDs reconcile to actually update the in-memory representation.
So does the in-memory representation have a way in which changes can be absorbed into it? There's no API to tell that, hey, somebody can push, like the CRD would push changes, right? Like somebody applies the CRD and you want to push the changes. There's no notification mechanism where you can push that change into the state of the state that's running in the pod right now, right?
Correct.
Yes.
Okay, so what I'm trying to say is, like, maybe consider splitting up. I mean, even if we use the same memory store or whatever, but at least from an interface standpoint, maybe have a notification mechanism that enables a push model of cert changes, and it can come from FS events or it can come from a CRD put or a poll directly from Key Vault or whatever the thing that's running on the site, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
And also back to the scenario for standalone service. So I think currently we are not fully testing this scenario. So
Yeah, we're
I'm
not.
not confident on the experience. So I wonder if we should just create an issue for now and checking, like, for example, currently we know that the periodic retrieval or also the retrieval will be something we need to do on this scenario. So we can add that for now. And in the future, if we have any new design or new features, we can always add that. So once we work on this scenario, then we will know everything we need to handle.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. We can, in the whole implementation of like where you're actually absorbing those events from, we can discuss as the scenario comes about. So if it's like the standalone server scenario, if it's using file system events or whatever, we can implement it then. But if we can maybe set the foundation for that so that we're not just relying upon in the reconcile method directly calling the certificate update or key update methods directly. We have some formalized way we can kind of absorb those events, and then it'll make it easier in the future when we do decide to go down a different route. So
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense, Akash. So we're thinking maybe a common interface that can be shared, not tied down to Kubernetes.
that would be my vote, and then we can keep it pretty dead simple right now, and just add whatever we think is going to be necessary for Kubernetes, and then try to make it a little bit more generic. But at least we have that set there so that when we do decide to build something else, we're have a starting point at least.
Just to confirm my understanding, so mainly putting some kind of interface over top that would be in between the reconcile and the get methods that would more or less be a detect, like, did something change? Do I need to call reconcile and then reconcile calls get? Is that kind of the general idea? Is some kind of mechanism that is able to determine if there's been changes on the provider?
I feel currently like in this reconcile method, we just update the in-memory directory. So, and with the interface, then I think we will just send a notification to that interface, and then I think the overall workflow of this reconcile is still the same, but it's just cause maybe a different interface API to notify this like change.
Okay.
I see Sajay's comment about a push model. Previously, when we were talking about the, like, if Azure Key Vault pushes events, and that was most KMS providers, they do have a mechanism for the push model. Is that correct?
So then, is a question for me?
Just wondering, we previously looked into the push model because it was suggested by.
Yes, I can talk about something. Yeah, I also didn't remember the name. Anyway, so for the popular KMS, they support this called event driven, and I also did a comparison in my proposal. Because there are some issues. For example, it could be provider basis. So different provider, they have different ways. So you need to investigate and also integrate with different providers. So, that means with pool mode, it will be it will be a common solution, right? If the KMS they support, sorry, if the certificate rotate, we can periodically pull. So it will be a common solution for all the KMS. Another thing is that with event driven, it could be in some case you will miss some events, some error handling. You still need to pull to check if you missed those events. So with that, I think I may have some other points in my spec. So that's from the spec, I recommend this pool
Pool
mode.
model. Got it. Yeah, as long as we know, we can say why we chose the pool model. I think you're right. Like it doesn't handle all the scenarios. Like for example, if the identity lost permission, but there's no updates on the KMS side, we won't get the update.
Yeah, yes, that's true.
Yeah. Okay, so I think what we're saying here is we'll continue with the pool model, but we will need like a layer of abstraction. But the implementation of getting the reconciled job could be Kubernetes specific.
Got it.
Okay.
One more question related to reconcile. I try to have a better understanding. So the current reconcile was triggered by. I want to understand the implementation. How this current reconcile triggered?
Correct me if I'm wrong, Kosh, but I think the reconcile for the KMP is only is only executed the one time when the resource is created. And so if you ever have any kind of scenario where you need to refresh search or something, you delete the resource or recreate it to get that to trigger again. Is that accurate?
Yes, so at the API server level, technically when you do kubectl apply and it's like a patch that you're doing, a patch translates to like a delete and then a recreate. So even if you see in the Ratify log, you'll see that resource was updated. It's actually like it's deleting the resource and then reapplying it onto the cluster. So even when you do an Helm install and it applies those resources for the first time, that's just a put call. But when you update that template for whatever example, for example, let's say you update the certificate identifier or something like that, even though from a user point of view, it's an update, it's actually a delete and a put again. So you're deleting the resource and then putting it again. That's my understanding, but Bin, Susan, you guys have also seen this. Is that in line with what you've seen as well?
Yes, that's correct.
But when some error happens, it seems that it can periodically reconcile from the server, right?
Yes, it
Yes.
will try to loop in a few runs and until it will. I think it will not like indefinitely loop, but will retry sometimes.
It's a retry. Yep.
Yeah. What's the interval for that? Is it controlled by default some Kubernetes mechanism, or is controlled by Ratify?
I think it's Kubernetes stuff.
Okay. Yeah. Why I mentioned this is I try to understand this because user could specify wrong value, right? So it's a different interval, right? Comparing to ours. So yeah, but that's handled by the Kubernetes. I don't think any big problem for that when error happens. Okay, thanks.
Cool. Thanks, Josh. Is there another other points of discussion?
Let's see here. None that I don't think would be that are addressed in E's proposal with, you know, like default values and that kind of thing, like how many cert versions. Yeah, I think the main one that we spent the most time on was how do we want to put the retry or the reconcile logic in there or the interval. The rest of them I might have more as I continue work, but go ahead, Akash.
There was one comment that I had left earlier today. If you scroll down, Bin. No, actually. So, okay, so basically, yeah, it's step 3, that comment right where your cursor is at.
This one?
Yep, this one. So for this one, when you specify this specific version, my understanding is that you're also checking the latest version and then outputting if it's different from the latest version. So if we do like an update and we see that the specific version is actually not the latest version, then we're warning the user about it.
Yeah, we could do nothing. I'm up to discussion there.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if like what the like is there a user scenario that we'd want
Yeah,
to
that's
do.
the exact scenario. Like say you specified version 1 of the key, the reconcile triggered, it noticed that it rotated and now 1 and 2 exist that are both valid.
Yep.
It'll say, hey, there's a latest. There's another version of this that's different from what you've specified. But I'm not going to update. It won't update the cache because you've, you know, essentially hard coded or told it specifically this version. So you either need to go like update your configuration to include the new version or use, you know, like no version and then it'll take a couple versions of the key. That was my thinking behind it.
I just have one concern is that if users specify like a previous version but the version in the memory is the latest one, then we do have a warning log, but the cache is not updated. Then users if users don't check the log, then they might think the version is already updated.
How do we expect people? So what would be the use case where they specify the version of the key? My expectation was if they specify the version, they only want to have that in memory and not follow any kind of like automatic rotation. So they might not even want to be warned, you know, like I've set it to version 1, only use version 1. And, you know, I put it there. So if I want to go to version 2, I'll do it myself kind of thing. Is that a fair assumption from the user's perspective that we're trying to accomplish?
Do you have any?
I think it makes sense if users specify a version, then they have this specific version. So the only cached version is this specific version. If they want to use another version, they need to manually specify another version. So then in the memory, there will be 2 versions. I think what Josh, you just mentioned is that for the periodic check, you detected there is a newer version, right? You just inform or create a log that there is the latest version, right?
Yeah, maybe info would be better
version.
wording there instead of a warning, just an info. Like, hey, there's another key.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think the log could be good because originally my thought is that user want to use something, then they should be aware of this, and we should in the document mention this. Only this key will be used. But if you produced a log, I think this is very kind to the user. So maybe user did not realize there is a latest version, right? Then they can start it to manually specify it. I think a log is a good. It's a good. But we don't not change any cached versions, only in the specific version that user wants. Yeah.
I
I have
think
similar.
go ahead.
Yeah. Hey there, I have similar comments with Akash and Yi, and I think maybe not generating warning log. I think info level log is enough. Just a heads up for users that they have a latest key or a new version that is available in their KMS. A warning log may cause some unexpected problems to users' pipelines. If users intentionally specify a version key or version cert in their Ratify, I think info level log should be enough.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, sounds good to me. Because based on current observation with some teams, it seems that their pipeline will handle some warning log. So if we produce
Correct.
this, but user intentionally they want to use this specified version, so they need to ignore this version every time, it will be maybe annoying. So I think info will be enough.
Sure. Josh, just a note, we've recently moved to using GitHub pull request for design reviews as well to better keep track of like where all the design docs are and all the comment. So would you be able to create a PR with the same content?
Of course, yeah.
And yeah, for everyone, like new comments should be added onto the PR.
I'll get
It can
that
be
put in.
design.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Go ahead,
Yeah, we
Bin,
have
sorry.
all the.
Yeah, this is a good call out, and I wanna comment that if we have everything, every discussion document in GitHub, it will be automatically monitored by third-party tools. So as you may know that we are in the CNCF donation process, CNCF may use tools like LFX Insight to monitor how this project activity going on GitHub and how many commits, how many pull requests and reviews in a certain period. So I think it's a good call out that we can have all of our technical and design discussions in GitHub. HackMD will load some historical metrics and discussions because it's only on HackMD platform.
Yeah. Any more feedback?
No, and currently ORAS and Notary project have very transparent metrics available on LFX Insight tool. So if Ratify could become a sandbox project in CNCF, we should be able to view all of those insights and community metrics via that tool. That's the reason that we are recommended to keep all of our work public and on GitHub. Thanks.
Yeah,
Yeah, thanks, George.
this is my bad, Josh. I should have told you to do the PR about that.
Yeah, I was just the notes file, and then I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
No, it's fine. I can absolutely do that. I'll get a PR in.
I
Yeah,
can
we can just
I can
talk.
transfer these comments over there too. I'll try to summarize and put them on the PR too.
We are running out of time, but we have 3 issues need to be tracked. I just wonder if there are any like important issues that we want to track today, so we can run through quickly.
I've added these just to like slowly get through our triage queue. Nothing urgent. I think we can just move it to top of the list next meeting.
Okay, cool.
And
Thanks,
meanwhile,
FM.
people can still review the issues and asynchronously discuss as well.
Okay. And also, I think maybe PMs joined late for this meeting, so we will do the issue triage in the committee meeting instead of the peer review meetings. So I think if we have in the future, if we have more time, we can triage like other issues.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, cool. Okay, that's everything.
Thank you, Bin Bin. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you
Thank
for your
you,
time,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.